It's my pleasure to be joined by Chuck Lowman, running for State House of Representatives, District 1, Seat B. So, without any further ado, Chuck Lowman, tell us about yourself and how you arrived at this place where you're running for office.
Sure. Well, I think I've always had the bug for community service, and I was an Eagle Scout and uh, did all that kind of stuff growing up. And I've served in the mission field all over the world. I've been an Army chaplain for 12 years, served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Uh, we landed here in 2019 back in Idaho and have continued to serve our community. I was asked by a young man in our church if I knew of anyone interested in politics, and I kind of hemmed and hawed and then said, "Yeah, I've thought about it." And he said, "Well, good, because I was going to ask you." And that's kind of what started us on this path.
Cool. So, you mentioned both missionary service and military service. That's an interesting combination. Um, what are some of the places you've seen, and how does that inform your perspective as you're looking at the political situation here?
Sure. I've served in 4 countries in Africa, so Ethiopia, Gabon, Senegal, and the
Oh,
Gambia. And then as well, I've been in India, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Korea as well. So, um, yeah, one of the things that informs my perspectives on especially natural resource management, when I first went to Ethiopia, I was made well aware of what good environmental protection does for our community, and seeing the exact opposite in some of those third world countries, and made me grateful for the fact that we do have environmental concerns and protections in place to keep our waters and our airs clean. Another thing that I saw when I was in Gabon, West Africa, was how Europe really just was robbing Africans of good jobs. And what I mean by that is for every gallon of oil that left their country, a dollar went right into the president's pocket.
hmm.
And he was considered the third richest man in the world. None of that oil was refined in the country. And then as well, their vast hardwood forests in the tropical rainforest there were being harvested, literally shipped down the rivers, put onto big shipping boats that had uh, sawmills, lumber yard, sawmills on those ships. They would process that wood while they were underway to Europe to deliver those products. None of those jobs stayed in Gabon that could be used to help bring that country out of poverty. And so uh, one of the things is I look to our use of natural resources in the United States and how we're continuing to restrict the use of our natural resources. We're becoming increasingly dependent on other nations to provide things like plywood. Uh, so that is a real concern to me when we have resources that can be used to provide jobs and well-being for our citizens in our nation.
You have some specific ideas about Idaho's resources? Obviously, we have forests and minerals, and water is hugely important. The National Laboratory. Um, do you have some specific ideas on how the legislature can, maybe improve our processes, make sure we keep jobs here, make sure we are as self-sufficient as possible?
Sure. Well, one of the regrettable things is the plywood plant that was at one time the largest in North America outside of Potlatch is no longer in operation. And so uh, we need to find ways to bring uh, products like that back to the United States. And that may look like increasing pressure on our national counterparts to impose tariffs on countries that don't have the same environmental restrictions that we do to level the playing field in that regard.
Mhm.
The other thing is for our uh, representatives to really uh, increase the effectiveness of the good neighbor policy, where the state of Idaho and other concerned citizens can have more of an influence in how our national forests and our public lands are managed to ensure that folks still have the ability to access those lands to make a living.
So you've obviously been on the campaign trail. You've been, meeting people. What are you hearing from your voters in the first district? It's far away from me. I'm down here in the Treasure Valley. You know, so I see things
Well,
from a distance. So yeah, I'm just curious what you're hearing from folks. What are their priorities?
yeah, so education is always going to be a big priority. And for our rural counties, uh, although House Bill 521 is a good start to providing funding to update and modernize our buildings, I would say that it has not stopped the bleeding, so to speak. There are some schools that are in uh, real disrepair. And though we have some money to help update those schools, it's not going to be sufficient to create that uniform education experience that is mandated by the Constitution for the legislature to make sure it happens. I would like to see there be an assessment of the schools in our state, and that we address those school districts and those schools with the greatest need first with those monies.
Hmm.
Uh, right now, it's just being divvied out by uh, average daily attendance. And though that seems like on the surface a good idea, but West Ada County School District has 60,000 students, whereas our district doesn't have 60,000 people. So that creates a real concern for us to be able to provide modern schools and a modern education experience here in our boundary in Bonner County. The other thing that we are concerned about is development, development of our rural landscape and losing that landscape to development. We've got to work with our county counterparts on creating good development policies. We do have an issue up here with affordable housing. Uh, Young couples and families cannot stay in our county just because it's too expensive for them to live here unless they find some remote property like we did and we carve it out ourselves. It's really hard for a young family to stay in the area.
What do you think the legislature could do to improve that, to, balance, because it seems like that's almost contradictory to me that, the easy answer to affordable housing is more supply, but you
Yep.
also don't want to turn the entire district into a big subdivision. So
Yeah.
what could you do?
So one of the things that I think through is how do we create incentives for people to purchase land and keep it in production while developing a portion of that for their residential space, their homestead space. So for my community, for example, we're about 20 lots, averaging from size to 3 and 4 acres up to 7 to 10 acres. Now, if you have a 5 acre lot, you can develop 1 acre for your homestead, and that leaves you 4 acres of still forested land. The problem is that's all taxed as rural residential.
Hmm.
Whereas a person had 6 acres and they developed 1 acre, they could put the 5 acres uh, into a logging production tax exemption. But if
Interesting.
all the neighbors came together, we could probably get 100 to 120 acres of contiguous forest land that we could then put into a production management plan. Uh, One, to keep our forests managed properly so we don't turn into Southern California where we burn everything down. And then there will be plenty of land to buy, I guess.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
I
nobody
want to
wants that.
prevent that. I want folks to come together. And there's many ways that you can manage forests. You can manage them for production. You can manage them for wildlife. You can manage them for scenic, uh, you know, value. You can come together as a community and work out that management plan. And if you get a bunch of folks together to do that and provide an incentive, that's a way for us to prevent fires up here by getting folks on an active forest management plan.
Interesting. One thing I've enjoyed about speaking to so many different candidates is that the needs of each region are very different. So hearing about what's going on up in Bonner and Boundary counties is different from what's down here in Ada County, which is different from what's out in, Twin Falls, Jerome County. Um, yeah, forest, that's something I don't hear much about. I hear a lot about water and
Yeah,
energy, but not so much about forests. But that's obviously, something that's vitally important. I come from Western Washington. I miss the forests. I
yeah,
always
yeah.
enjoy visiting up north.
Well, and our forests are even different than some of those Western Washington forests. We're more of a wet uh, cedar hemlock forest type up here, and that has a 100-year burn cycle. From our natural history, we know that, and it's been 100 years since it's burned. So our fuel levels are higher than they should be, and we really need to get after that active forest management.
So flipping over a little bit, you mentioned the schools briefly. Um, it's a very complicated, contentious issue with obviously they passed the facilities bill this year, and then passed House Bill 292 last year to reduce property taxes. And so, there's all sorts of things that go into it with the, what's the funding formula? How much should the state contribute? How much, can the counties or districts raise through levies and bonds? And nevertheless, what I hear from a lot of people is that property taxes are one of the biggest issues. Um, do you have thoughts on, reforming that process, changing it around, or, you know, where would you take it from here?
Yeah, so I definitely think we need a varied and diversified tax structure. I've heard some folks mention that we should just go to straight sales tax and eliminate property taxes altogether. The problem is that would really put a hamper on our local economies, especially when you can just go to Oregon and pay no sales tax on goods and services there. Um, that's definitely a concern. Um, I think sales tax is definitely the fairest and most equitable way to tax. I would like to see an exemption on food staples. So bread, milk, cheese, certain cuts of meat, uh, rice, beans, just so if a family is genuinely like struggling to make it by, they can get the basics without having to pay the extra sales tax on those groceries. I'm not saying groceries across the board, right? But on just those staple items that I guess it's the old Dave Ramsey method, beans and rice and beans.
Yeah.
If you got to do that, and then so
Oh, and I'm sure potatoes would have to be on the list.
yeah, exactly.
Um, since we're talking about schools, another, discussion, another debate has been, school choice. Now, obviously, we do have school choice in Idaho. Parents can choose to
Yep.
send their children to private schools, micro schools, charter schools, public schools, or homeschool, or whatever else there might be. But the question is, should there be some form of tax money following the child? 2 years ago, there was an education savings account that was debated on the Senate floor and didn't make it past that. This year, there was a tax credit, but that didn't make it out of committee. So, would you support anything like that? Or if so, what kind? If not, what else can be done?
Yeah, so I come at vouchers for private schools and religious schools from a different tack, and I'm against them, and I'll tell you why. Um, Being in the military, the government will use money to uh, coerce people to act in certain ways. And so it may start out all good and well for uh, taxpayers for the money to follow the child, so to speak. That money will end up going to uh, private and religious schools, which is directly in violation of the Idaho Constitution. So their workaround is to give it directly to the family, and so I'll get to that other point here in a
Mhm.
second. But my point is that our private and our religious schools provide a very unique and important voice to our community, and I don't want to see that temptation to for those schools to change their voice because they're following the money. And I'll
Mhm.
give you a specific example of not necessarily schools, but a related incident that happened here um, just recently in our little community. We had uh, a group home for girls. It was called Kinderhaven, and it was for girls in the foster system that were from our local community. And a group brought in local donors, had fundraisers every year, and they were also very dependent on federal funds to continue that group home to function. Well, in 2016, there was a appropriations bill that was passed, and it included one paragraph that shut that whole operation down. Because what was happening in some other states is, as a child who is in a foster care system, they're kind of graded on certain levels of adoptability. You know, level one, they have the lowest emotional and behavioral issues, and they can be adopted out fairly easily. But as they go up the scale, more money follows that child. Uh, what they were finding is there were certain places that weren't properly treating those children, and instead of those children coming down in those emotional behavioral needs, they were actually going up. And there was some concern that this was actually nefarious, that people were making money off of these children. So they
Mm.
introduced a requirement that these facilities had to have um, a certified therapist and adopt a more clinical model for providing these group homes. Our little orphanage, or for lack of a better word, Kinderhaven, was not able to do that. We weren't able to hire that specialized person. And then what that would have required, then that group would have had to take children from all over the state, some with behavioral needs that they just could not handle and weren't appropriate for the group home. So they worked for years to try and get this change. And finally, in 2021, the law came into full effect, and this group home can no longer operate. So, long story short, my concern is for the private school and the religious school is, though they might want that federal or state money to bolster their school, it's going to come with strings attached. And it may not come initially, but at some point it will.
Mm.
And then those organizations are going to need to make a choice. Are they going to maintain their voice and their identity and who they are? Or are they going to shut down because they've created a dependency on those federal dollars?
I can see that concern.
Yeah. So
Um,
that's my concern. Um, I've never heard in a church saying they want to take federal money to do their church mission. Right.
uh,
So
yeah.
that's where I come from in this regard. Uh, I think that our public schools and our charter schools, and even we have a large homeschool community here that honestly wants to be left alone. And
Mm.
there's monies that can be, that homeschoolers can apply for to purchase for certain kinds of curriculum. And some families won't even take that. They just want to be left alone to do their own thing. Now, I do think there could be a fairness in taxing uh, policy where if they're uh, actively educating their children, they could get a tax rebate on just that portion of their property tax that is dedicated towards schools. I could see that as uh, a fairness and taxing issue. Uh, I would also posit that um, we're not just taking care of our kids when we pay our taxes in that regard. We're taking care of all kids, and some kids who don't have uh, the support at home to have the best education. And not to say that parents couldn't do it, but so take my family for example. We grew up in northern Nevada in Ely, and my mom has graduate work at Stanford, super intelligent. My dad worked for the Bureau of Land Management. My mom taught us to read at home, took us to the library, all that kind of stuff. And my younger brother just was not catching on. He was not a good student. Well, we moved to the big city of Reno, and there the school district employed a diagnostician who was able to sit down with my brother and find out that, oh, he actually had a reading disability, was able to give him some targeted therapy and brought him up. He graduated high school. He went on to college and did very well in college. He went on to work for Arizona Department of Lands, doing land management for them. And now he's working independently, writing grazing management plans for ranchers all over the state of Arizona. All of that because a school district had a diagnostician who was able to diagnose his reading disability.
Interesting.
And so that's something that I think as we look at what can the school districts do, they can provide really targeted uh, training and education to help kids meet their educational needs. And so I'm very fond of our public education system. It needs work in areas, but we are so blessed to have a system where folks are invited to participate on so many levels. Uh, whether it's sitting in on a curriculum committee where you go through every page of curriculum, you review it with teachers and other parents, you make sure that it's meeting our educational objectives set forth by the Department of Education. Uh, months-long processes, and it's a lot of work, but it allows parents to have that voice in what our education system is. And I'll tell you, uh, locally, we just did the 7th and 8th grade uh, social studies curriculum. They wanted to have teachers, five, on the curriculum committee. They could only have four because they could only find four interested parents.
Hmm.
And so if folks are genuinely concerned about our education system, if they're genuinely concerned about what's being delivered to our children, I encourage you, there are so many ways that you can get involved. Even if it's as simple as like getting your background check done and going and sitting in a first grade class and just reading a book to a kid that doesn't like to read, and hopefully helping them find the love of reading. Like that, if there's any message that I would want people to hear, it's that you have a gift to offer to our local schools. You can use it to help them make the best for every kid in our school system.
I think those of us, from a political perspective, those of us who are here, you and I, everyone else running for office, everyone you meet at, you know, party meetings or candidate events, those are the people who are already plugged in, and it's easy to forget that there's a majority of people who just, if they even bother voting, they just go, you know, figure it out at the polling place or drop it in the mail. And I feel like it's probably the same thing for schools. Those who are loudest are the ones who are already involved in one way or another, whether involved in their school board or in their children's schools, or, finding alternative education opportunities. But we need to speak to those people who are just outside of that bubble.
Yeah. Well, and I would encourage folks, especially that we are a retirement community. Our property taxes are $1,000 less than the national average, and so that attracts folks to come here to retire. If you're retired out there and you're looking for a way to bless your community, volunteer with your schools because they need the help. They need folks involved, and that's part of our civic duty, is to look at the gifts, talents, and abilities that I have to make the community better. And if there's a way that I can help, I'm going to do that.
Shifting gears a little bit, you're running for an open seat. Representative Sage Dixon has been there for a while. Did you ever get an opportunity to talk to him and see what he was doing? And did that shape your decision to go try to follow in his footsteps?
Sure. Well, so yes, I have spoke with Sage on a couple of occasions, and I'll make this clear: he is not endorsing anyone, and he's not endorsing me. So I just want to make that clear. Though he has been a good mentor in some ways, helping me understand the nature of the job. And there's some things that I've seen in Sage that I'm very impressed about. He was the chair of the ethics committee, and the way that folks get elected to that position is it is a blind ballot among all the other legislatures. And it's written on a piece of paper and it's put in a hat. And then the person with the most votes gets appointed as the chair to that ethics committee. He has been selected for that a number of times, and it's because how he operates as a legislator. He's had folks come into his office, supporters of his, who say they don't want to see this bill go before the committee and he says, I'm sorry, this has been submitted and we're going to discuss it in the committee. Uh, he does not play to those kind of manipulative politics at times. And he's taken some heat for that. And that's something that I hope that I could do as a legislator, that I would stand up to do what's right, regardless of the political consequence, that I would listen to all sides of the discussion. And then at the end of the day, it's my moral conscience that's going to make the decision ultimately, because I'm going to stand before my creator and give an account for that. Our parties, though my values align with the Republican Party in a lot of ways, the Republican Party isn't going to stand in judgment for its its votes. It's people. It's
Mm-hmm.
me. It's you. We will stand before our Creator to give an account. And so, at the end of the day, I've got to do what's right. And sometimes the right thing is not popular, but it's the right thing to do because we've done the hard work to listen to all sides of the issue, even sides that we don't agree with, and then do what's best for our community, our state, and our nation.
I was at a candidate forum a few days ago, and the moderator asked how these candidates and legislators uh, how they decided how to vote on various issues, and basically all of them repeated the same thing. They called it the three C's. Is it constitutional? How does it affect my constituents? And then finally, how does it weigh on my conscience? Um, I imagine people across the aisle will say the same thing. It's just how you interpret those things in your own perspective. So one question I've been asking people is, let's say you're in there, you get elected, there's some very complex issue that comes up. Maybe it's outside of your experience, but it's something that's really important. Um, how, first of all, how do you make the decision on how to vote? And then also, when you're there, you're surrounded by, it really is a different world. You've got lobbyists and um, staff and fellow legislators and other people in the government who, they all have their opinions and they're all coming to share it. They've all of them are experts in whatever field they are, so they all know what they're talking about. Um, with that, then how do you stay grounded with your constituents back home?
Sure. Well, I've definitely got to stay connected with my constituents, and that I have a phone number, 208-946-5928. Folks can call that. It goes right to my cell phone. I would love to have a discussion with them on that, whatever the issue is. The kind of the questions, is it constitutional? Yes, that's good. Is it something the government needs to be doing? That's another good question. Like, is this best served by the government, or is there other means that this issue can be resolved? Or is it something that we need to push down to lower levels? Is this something that we need to answer at the state, or is this something that the county or the district or whatever can answer on their own? The lowest is best, right?
Mhm.
So definitely that's one of the pieces in that. The other piece is you've got to use your critical thinking methods, right? You've got to look for those things that one of the things I remember in my Army career at the 10-year mark, you go through what's called intermediate level education. And I had a set of classes on rhetoric. And I've got a seminary degree. I've got a BS in wildlife management. I did well in high school. I do not remember any of those organizations ever teaching me anything about rhetoric. I think part of the problem is we just say, well, if you're in speech and debate, you like that kind of thing. But understanding the principles of rhetoric and logical fallacies and how that is used to manipulate conversation, uh, that's something that I ask my kids, I like, do you guys know this? Have you learned this? And if not, we're having a discussion because you've got to use those principles as you're engaging uh, what is the truth. And I've got 3,500 hours of uh, counseling that I've done for soldiers, married couples, individuals, team leaders, trying to get at what is the heart of the problem, what is the heart of the issue, and then coming up with creative solutions to work through that. So I found in marriage counseling, oftentimes when we uh, assume the worst about our spouse, we stop listening to them.
Mhm.
And so it's really hard in politics, especially in our day where folks want to demonize folks on the other side, or who don't agree with them on every jot and tittle of the law. It just gives them an excuse to stop listening. And I think that's a real travesty that our nation is facing now. I think that's the biggest travesty that we face as a people, is giving each other the benefit of the doubt, hearing each other out. We may disagree at the end of the day, but we owe each other uh, the dignity and respect to stop and listen long enough to understand the problem. If we can't understand the problem, then any solution that we come up with is not going to be sufficient.
So let's just go rapid fire through a couple issues. We already did education, uh, Second Amendment. I mean, everyone in Idaho says they support the Second Amendment, even the Democrats. We have constitutional carry now. Do you think our laws are now sufficient? Should there be any, restrictions? Should there be any changes, or what do you see there?
I think they're sufficient at this time. Um, yeah.
Red flag laws. It's
So I work, I've worked closely with behavioral health.
mhm.
Okay. I do see the value in someone who has been uh, involuntarily committed, and it would have to be someone who has been evaluated and then even though we stabilize them in a hospital from whatever issues they're going through, we then turn them back out into the world. And oftentimes they just wash back through the system again and again and again. And so I do think there needs to be discussion on what that looks like for folks that are in genuine uh, mental health distress, and what that looks like to keep the community safe. Um, One of the things that I think through, and again, I haven't formed solid opinions on this. This is part of the discussion I think we need to be having, is especially in our schools, children who are on psychotropic medications for whatever issues they're on. The school counselors need to be part of that overall care plan with their psychiatrist and psychologist, so that they can understand the signs and symptoms of when medications are going badly and what they need to be looking out for. Because when you start going down that route of psychotropic medications, even little adjustments and changes can really affect a person's mental health and their ability to think through stressors in life appropriately. And so one of the conversations we need to be having about keeping our schools safe is children who may rightly be on uh, mood changing medications. There needs to be a larger care group of people that are observing them and watching them to make sure that they're not doing something to harm themselves or someone else.
How about abortion? Dobbs repealed Roe v. Wade, overturned it, sent the decision to the states, and state of Idaho, essentially banned it with a couple of exceptions. Um,
Yep.
do you, think that's good where it is? Do you want it to be more strict? Do you want it to be loosened up? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I think what we do need to work towards is defining the language. And we've lost something like 20% of our OBGYNs. Now, some of those uh, people may say that they're just abortionists and they've just left, but it seems, if I'm like genuinely engaging in the discussion, that they find it difficult to do what they may see is morally required in the moment.
Hmm.
And so, again, I just want to be part of the conversation. I want to understand the full problem. I am fully against elective abortions and fully against abortions for the sake of, a child with a developmental or trisomy condition that's going to make it difficult for the parents. I'm against those sorts of abortions, but I'm also a bit of a realist in knowing that, like, when our abortion law was written in the 1890s, that the the death rate was 2,500 women per 100,000 live births. And that, so we don't want to return to that. So we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing by understanding the language, making sure it's sufficient. And then as well, one of the things I think through is if in any case that we want to remove someone of their right to life, liberty, or property, we need to, we go a legal route. And then in the case of the Fourth Amendment, and a disinterested judge reviews the facts of the case and then grants a warrant for the police officers or whoever's doing the investigation to search and seize property. I would like to see a similar methodology because for a doctor who feels that they're on shaky ground as far as a course of action, having a disinterested judge say, okay, you have met the legal tests and you can proceed in this direction, would alleviate that risk to them being able to practice medicine. So again, that's a conversation I think needs to be happen. I'm definitely for our most vulnerable population and the unborn child. They have a right to life as much as anyone else. I do also know that there are very extenuating circumstances that can make that a genuine moral conundrum that sometimes there just is no right answer. And so I don't want to pretend that I know everything that can ever happen in a pregnancy. I think that's unwise, and I don't think that it's good for law to try and dictate every moral decision that a person should ever make.
How about illegal immigration? That's another big issue nationally.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue people are talking about here in Idaho. We had two competing memorials in the legislature. One of them was pretty harsh. It essentially called out, the agricultural companies for employing illegal aliens, and then called on the Congress to impeach the president and close the border. And that one didn't go through. The one that did was more about from the perspective that we need to reform the system so that we can bring in more legal workers. However, the elephant in the room is that the McClure Center came out with a report saying there were at least 35,000 people working in Idaho now who aren't legally here. So, what should the legislature do? What do you think about it? Where do we stand on that?
Yeah. Well, I definitely like Trump's policy that the asylum policy that they need to apply for asylum in the first adjacent country to the country which they're fleeing. That shut the illegal immigration down to at least a manageable level compared to where it's at now, where we're literally sending troops in and ISP folks down to the Texas border to help control things. So we are a nation of immigrants. My family immigrated from Germany in the early 1900s and homesteaded a farm in eastern Colorado. We need to have pathways for people who are coming to seek and contribute to our society, ways for them to be able to do that effectively, so that they can pursue the American dream just like my ancestors did. So there is a very strong need for folks who are willing to work and work hard and work under not the greatest conditions. And so, and a lot of those needs are filled by our migrant worker community. So we definitely need to, if they are here and they're contributing to our society and they're doing the right thing in their daily lives, we got to have pathways for them to do it legally.
Well, I appreciate your time, especially coming from a car there. Oh,
Yeah.
hope it's a comfortable chair.
Oh,
Is there anything else that you want to cover that you want to let people know about, or closing thoughts?
yeah. I'm here because I want to be here. I'm here because I want to serve my community. There's been some nasty attacks here that saying I'm being funded by blue money. I'm just a rhino. I'm genuinely conservative. I'm genuinely a person who wants to uphold the Constitution. I've sworn to defend the Constitution. I've been there, done that, and I will continue to do that. But the other piece of it is I want to treat my neighbor as my neighbor and not as my enemy. And there's folks up here who are quick to call names and who are quick to dismiss folks who don't agree with them. And it's really driving a wedge in our community. So I want to be a source of change for that. I want to stand up for our community. I want to be there for our community. I want to hear the whole needs of our community and ultimately do what's right.
Chuck Lowman, running for State House of Representatives, District 1, Seat B. Thank you.